What would you do if the power grid collapsed tomorrow? Pause for a moment and think about it. Our lives are so intertwined with electricity that we seldom stop to consider how dependent we've become. From the moment we wake up to the minute we close our eyes at night, we're constantly plugged in. Now imagine a world where that plug is suddenly pulled. No more lights, no more refrigeration, no more Wi-Fi. Forget about your morning coffee brewed to perfection or streaming your favorite show. The power grid that we've taken for granted has collapsed, and life as we know it has come to a standstill. This isn't some sci-fi movie plot or dystopian fiction. It's a real possibility that could be triggered by a range of factors, from cyber attacks to natural disasters. And the consequences? They'd be far-reaching, affecting every facet of our daily lives. Picture this. Traffic lights go dark, causing chaos on the roads. Supermarkets run out of food as refrigeration systems fail. Hospitals struggle to provide basic care without electricity. Water treatment plants cease operation, leading to a shortage of clean drinking water. In short, the world would be plunged into a state of disorder and confusion. But here's the kicker. While the whole situation sounds quite grim, it's not entirely hopeless. Like a cowboy preparing for a long journey across the Wild West, we too can prepare for such a scenario. It's all about understanding the landscape, knowing the dangers, and planning accordingly. So what's the first step? It's knowing where not to be. Certain places would become downright dangerous in the event of a power grid collapse. These are the areas where the effects of such a catastrophe would be magnified, places you'd want to avoid like the plague. Let's dive into the top 5 places you'd want to steer clear of if such a catastrophe were to occur. First on our list, urban areas, cities and densely populated regions. You might reckon that these concrete jungles would be safe havens, places where you could hunker down and weather the storm. But in reality, these bustling metropolises could turn into your worst nightmare when the power grid collapses. Now, don't get me wrong, cities have their charms. They're full of life, culture, and diversity. But when the electricity goes out, those very charms can become liabilities. The high population density that gives cities their vibrancy would suddenly become a source of conflict and competition. Imagine this. The power goes out. No more electricity to run your fridge, your heating, your lights. The shops are out of food and the ATMs are down. Panic sets in. People are scared, hungry, and desperate. And in such situations, desperation can lead to violence. And it's not just the potential for violence that makes urban areas risky. There's also the issue of resources, or rather the lack thereof. Cities are largely dependent on the surrounding rural areas for their food and water. But when the power grid collapses, transportation systems would likely fail too, disrupting the supply chains that bring those resources into the city. Without a steady supply of food and water, urban areas could quickly become uninhabitable, and if you're stuck in a city when that happens, you could find yourself in a dire situation, forced to compete with others for the dwindling resources. But it's not all doom and gloom. If you're living in an urban area and you're worried about a potential grid collapse, there are things you can do to prepare. For starters, you could keep a stockpile of non-perishable food and water at home. And I mean a good stockpile, not just a couple of cans of beans and a few bottles of water. You could also consider investing in a portable generator or solar panels to provide you with some power when the grid goes down. And don't forget about alternative forms of transport. If the roads are gridlocked and public transport is down, a bicycle could be your ticket to freedom. And while we're on the subject of transport, it's worth considering having a bug-out plan. That's a plan for getting out of the city and heading to a safer location if things get too hairy. You could have a rural retreat stocked with supplies, or a network of friends or family in less populated areas who would be willing to take you in. But remember, preparation is key. The more you prepare now, the better your chances of survival if the worst should happen. And that means not just stockpiling supplies, but also learning survival skills like how to purify water, how to start a fire, how to forage for food. These skills could be the difference between life and death in a post-grid world. So, there you have it. Urban areas, lively, bustling, vibrant places that can quickly turn into danger zones when the power goes out. The high population density, the potential for violence, the lack of resources, all these factors make cities risky places to be in a grid-down scenario. And while you can take steps to prepare if you're living in a city, the best strategy might be to avoid urban areas altogether if you can. Because when the lights go out, you might want to be far away from the city lights that no longer shine. Next up, hospitals. A place of healing could turn hazardous. Now, that might be a surprise to some of you. After all, hospitals are places we go to when we're ill, when we're injured, when we need help, right? But in a world where the power grid has collapsed, hospitals present a unique set of challenges and dangers that would be best avoided if at all possible. Firstly, consider the very nature of a hospital. It's a place where people who are sick, and therefore potentially contagious, gather. Now, in normal circumstances, hospitals have measures in place to control the spread of diseases. But if the power grid collapses, those measures would quickly become ineffective. Air filtration systems would stop working, sterilization processes would be compromised, and before you know it, hospitals could become hotbeds for disease outbreaks. And then there's the issue of medical equipment. Modern hospitals are heavily reliant on electricity to power everything from life-saving machines to the lights in the hallways. Without power, much of this equipment would be rendered useless. Even if backup generators were available, they would only provide a temporary solution and would eventually run out of fuel. Furthermore, hospitals are designed to function within a society that has a robust infrastructure. They rely on regular deliveries of medical supplies, a constant supply of clean water, and a functioning sewage system. If the power grid collapses, those deliveries would likely cease, the clean water supply could be compromised, and the sewage system could malfunction, leading to a whole host of additional problems. But perhaps the most alarming potential danger of a hospital in a post-power world is the high risk of chaos and panic. Hospitals are places that people instinctively turn to in times of crisis. But without power, hospitals would be ill-equipped to handle the influx of patients. The result could be a chaotic and potentially dangerous situation. Imagine, if you will, a hospital in the immediate aftermath of a power grid collapse. The lights go out, machines stop working, and panic sets in. Doctors and nurses are doing their best to provide care, but without electricity, their capabilities are severely limited. Patients and their families are scared and desperate, leading to heightened tensions and the potential for violent confrontations. In such a scenario, a hospital could quickly become a place of danger rather than a place of healing. It's a grim picture, I know, but it's important to consider these possibilities when planning for a world without power. So, what's the takeaway here? If you're a homesteader or a doomsday prepper, you'll want to think twice before heading to a hospital after a power grid collapse. Instead, consider alternative options for medical care. Learn basic first aid skills, stock up on essential medical supplies, and develop a plan for dealing with medical emergencies without relying on hospitals. In a world without power, hospitals might not be the haven they once were. It's a sobering thought, but it's important to be prepared for all eventualities. In the end, your safety and survival could depend on it. Third on our list, coastal regions. Beautiful, but potentially deadly. As you soak in the expansive view of the sea, it's easy to forget the potential dangers that lurk beneath its tranquil surface. It's even easier to forget how dependent we are on systems of control and infrastructure to keep us safe from the sea's wrath. But what happens when the power grid collapses and these systems fail? Consider this. Coastal regions are at risk of flooding, even more so without functioning flood defenses. When the grid goes down, pumps that keep water levels at bay, gates that hold back tidal surges, and barriers that protect against storm swells all cease to work. Low-lying areas could quickly become inundated, turning your picturesque seaside home into a waterlogged disaster zone. Then there's the weather. Coastal regions are notorious for their unpredictable and often severe weather patterns. Without the power grid, our ability to forecast and prepare for these weather events diminishes. Hurricanes, typhoons, and severe storms could strike without warning, their impact amplified by the lack of warning and preparation. Moreover, without power, communication networks are likely to fail, leaving you cut off from the rest of the world. This isolation could prove deadly in an emergency situation when you most need help. Now let's talk resources. Coastal regions often rely heavily on imports for essential supplies such as food, water, and fuel. With the power grid down, transportation networks could be severely disrupted, leading to shortages. Unless you're an expert fisherman or have your own self-sustaining farm, finding food could become a significant challenge. And don't forget about the social aspect. Coastal regions, especially those with popular beaches or tourist attractions, tend to have high population densities. In a grid-down scenario, this could lead to increased competition for resources, potential conflict, and a higher risk of disease spread. Lastly, consider the long-term effects. Even if you manage to survive the initial aftermath, the coastal environment could change dramatically. Rising sea levels, increased erosion, and changes in wildlife populations could make living by the sea a very different experience. So, as you can see, while coastal regions may be captivating with their mesmerizing beauty and tantalizing allure, they come with a set of challenges that can be exacerbated in the event of a power grid collapse. It's not about spreading fear, but about understanding the risks and preparing accordingly. If you live in a coastal region, consider how you can make your home more resilient to flooding, how you can stockpile resources, and how you can develop a communication plan that doesn't rely on the power grid. When the grid goes down, the coast might not be the most hospitable place. But with the right preparation and mindset, you can increase your chances of weathering any storm that comes your way. Fourth, nuclear power plants, a ticking time bomb without power. In the event of a power grid collapse, the dangers that lurk within these colossal structures are amplified. A nuclear power plant, you see, is a lot like a sleeping dragon. As long as the dragon is calm and well-fed, it's a source of great power and prosperity. But if that dragon wakes up hungry and angry, well, that's a whole different story. Nuclear power plants operate on a delicate balance of energy production and cooling systems. If the power grid goes down, this balance can be disrupted. The cooling system needs power to function, and if it fails, we could be looking at a nuclear meltdown. Now, that's not to say that these power plants don't have safety measures in place. They do. They have backup generators and layers of protective systems. But these are designed to handle short-term outages, not prolonged grid failures. If the cooling systems fail, the reactors can overheat, leading to what's known as a nuclear meltdown. This is where the nuclear fuel becomes so hot that it melts through the containment vessel, releasing a large amount of radiation into the environment. It's the kind of scenario that keeps nuclear engineers up at night. But let's say, for argument's sake, that the safety measures hold up and a meltdown is prevented. There are still other dangers to consider. For instance, nuclear power plants store spent fuel rods on site in cooling pools. These rods are still dangerously radioactive and require constant cooling. If the cooling systems fail, these rods could overheat and catch fire, releasing radiation into the atmosphere. Now you might be thinking, well, if something goes wrong, surely the emergency response teams will handle it. And under normal circumstances, you'd be right. But remember, we're talking about a widespread power grid collapse here. Emergency services will likely be overwhelmed, roads could be impassable, communication systems might be down. The swift and efficient response we're used to might not be available. Moreover, even if a nuclear incident is averted, these facilities will likely be high-security areas. They'll be guarded to prevent any unauthorized access, and those guards might not be too friendly to wanderers who happen to stumble upon their post. In a nutshell, the proximity to nuclear power plants after a grid collapse presents a cocktail of potential hazards: possible meltdowns, radiation, fires, and a lack of emergency response capabilities. It's a risky game to play, and the stakes are as high as they come. So, if you're planning for a potential grid collapse, it would be wise to steer clear of these power plants. A safe distance would be at least 20 miles. But further is always better when it comes to radiation. Without power to keep them safe, nuclear power plants might become zones of exclusion. Last but not least, prisons. Without power, they could become a breeding ground for chaos. Now imagine this scenario. The power grid collapses, plunging society into darkness. The usual order of things is disrupted, and that disruption extends to places you might not immediately think of, like prisons. Prisons, after all, rely heavily on electricity. It powers the surveillance systems, the locks on the cells, and the communication systems. Without power, all of these crucial components can fail, and that's when the real trouble begins. Picture a prison without functioning locks. Inmates, some potentially dangerous, could easily escape. Without surveillance, the prison guards would be largely blind, unable to monitor the prisoners' activities effectively. And without communication systems, external help would be difficult to summon. This could lead to a volatile situation, with the potential for violence and lawlessness to spill out into the surrounding areas. And it's not just the immediate vicinity of the prison that could be affected. Inmates who manage to escape could travel far and wide, bringing with them a potential for increased crime and disorder. This could pose a serious risk to nearby communities, particularly in the immediate aftermath of a power grid collapse, when law enforcement resources are likely to be stretched thin. But it's not just the potential for escaped prisoners that makes prisons a place to avoid after a power grid collapse. Prisons are often located in remote areas, far from resources like food and water. If you found yourself stranded near a prison following a grid collapse, you could be stuck in a desolate location, far from help and essential supplies. So, how can you prepare for such a situation? Well, for starters, know your surroundings. If you live near a prison, consider having a plan in place for a quick evacuation. This could involve having a pre-packed bag with essential supplies, a planned route for escape, and a designated safe place to head to. Additionally, keep abreast of news and updates. If a power grid collapse does occur, information is going to be your most valuable resource. Knowing what's happening, particularly in relation to prisons, could be the difference between staying safe and finding yourself in a dangerous situation. Also consider investing in self-defense tools and learning how to use them. In a lawless world, being able to protect yourself and your family could be critical. But perhaps most importantly, remember the importance of community. In times of crisis, having a network of people you can rely on can make all the difference. Whether it's sharing resources, providing emotional support, or simply banding together for safety, community can be a powerful tool for survival. In a world without power, prisons could become a place you definitely want to avoid. So, we've covered the top 5 places to avoid if the power grid were to collapse. Let's take a moment to recap and hammer home why these locales could pose a significant risk in the event of a power outage. Firstly, we discussed urban areas. Without the usual amenities that city life provides, these densely populated regions could quickly descend into chaos. Resources would become scarce, leading to potential conflict, and the lack of power would affect everything from transportation to communication. Then we highlighted hospitals. While these are typically places of refuge, in a power grid collapse, they could become danger zones. The dependency on electrical equipment and the potential for overcrowding with people seeking help could make hospitals a risky proposition. Our third location was coastal regions. The allure of the sea might seem appealing, but these areas could be hit hard by a lack of power. Disruptions to weather prediction systems could leave coastal residents vulnerable to natural disasters, and the lack of power could affect water sanitation and food storage. We also touched on nuclear power plants. These facilities, although usually safe, could pose a significant risk in the event of a power outage. The potential for nuclear fallout and radiation sickness makes these areas a definite no-go zone. And finally, we discussed prisons. If a power grid collapse compromised security systems, prisons could become extremely dangerous places, with the potential for inmate uprisings and escapes. But remember, the aim of this discussion is not to scare you, but to prepare you. Having a plan in place and being aware of the potential dangers can make all the difference in a crisis situation. It's about equipping you with the knowledge to make informed decisions, to keep you and your loved ones safe in the event of a power grid collapse. Remember, knowledge is power even when there's no power to be had. Stay safe, stay prepared.